Hello, everyone. I think today we're going to tackle the stats. I know that's pretty much where we left off last time with the damage actor doing the damage and applying some sort of change in value effectively. We're not doing we didn't do the health. I mean, the health was just simple. You just have to set up a variable and then multicast the update and that would be it. But seeing as how I want stats other than health, we're going to do that today. So, if you're new here, welcome. If you're rejoining, again, glad to have you back. So I believe we're going to start off here by creating a database for our stats. So the stat system is going to be very similar to the one that we did before, where we have a set level, a current amount, a max amount, and the experience associated with it. So that's going to require us probably to make some custom objects, something similar to how the damage type works, but just for stats. And I believe we're also going to need a new component because I don't think we want to do it in the health component, which makes me think that we might want to rename the health component to something else because that health component just handles the spawning of the damage, and then the damage actually deals with it. uh, yeah. So, but I mean, like that's how that works. So when we deal the damage, instead of applying it to some sort of float value, we'll say to send it to off this hit actor when we deal the damage. We can send this to maybe like an interface call, and then we'll need to change these data damage properties to pass in a stats, and then we can apply the stat changes. And then on the other side, it wouldn't matter whether or not it's a component or wherever we're sending it, because the hit actor would just be an interface call. So it doesn't matter what happens on the other side. We can just simply implement our functionality here and then go implement the functionality on the other side. Okay, so I think the second step here is we're going to create the stat types, right? The stat types database here. That's what I did. So the stat type has a few things here. It will also need a few other things here. So I'll come back to this. So we needed these few assets, and I'll explain what these assets do in a minute. But then we also need to go along with this a class. So I created the stat type. Now this is just an object. You can see that the parent class is just an object. I create an interface to go along with it, so it looks similar to like the damage types, right? So that's how this is going to be structured. The interface here has the as, and it has a couple of accessors here. So we have get level, get current experience, get next level experience, get current value, and then get the max value. Now this is slightly different than the last version that we did. And the last version, all these things were like separate, and they had all their own separate objects. But I think for this one, we're gonna put all this data together. So these just have a couple accessors, and of course these are just all floats on the return values. So in the object here, we have the level, experience, next level, value, max value, with all these accessors. They just simply have just passing it back, just returning it. So that'll be for the stat base, right? So that's our stat base, parent class is an object. Now in our database here, we'll start with the structure. And this is just going to have our root data and then the stat type class. So in this case, it's going to be the stat base because that's how we're going to use to identify it. We use the interface for all the accessors and things like that we need to do on it. We've got the interface for the database and the stat. The find now is actually slightly different. We're going to be using an enumerator, eStat, I'm going to call it. I'm just going to call it eStat instead. The PDA here, same thing, but the map instead now is going to be the eStat with the stat data. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I think it's a little easier to just simply have an enumerator to say, So the E stat here, which is a numerator, it has like health, energy, and none, basically. I just put default for none, and then it'll have health and energy. So basically, these are your categories that you're going to be using, right? So you'll have health, you'll have energy, you might have mining, you might have strength, you might have attack speed, defense, armor, things like that, you know? So these are like your categories that you're going to be working with. And so you have categories linked to classes now. If we see in like the actual data asset, we can see when we add a new one, here it pops up as none, and then we can select from the drop down what we want. I'm going to just go ahead and delete this one. We don't need that one. So none is just going to be kind of just like a catch-all, because when you add multiple enumerators to a map, so for example, if you add none here, you can't actually add another one while this is here. So if you actually put health as the first one, it will just keep throwing you this issue because you're like, well, I already have health here. Why can't I add it? Well, because whatever the first value is in the enumerator, that considers it the default value. So that's why there's none. That's basically it. So we've got health, we've got energy. This is going to take in the stat base class here for both of these. So these stat bases, they'll control like, your experience, scaling, getting the current level, adding to the current level, calculating experience and stuff like that. So now we just need to take this data. I'll save all that. We'll just need to take this data, modify our damage and our ability to use a certain to use a to use these stats basically. So we'll need a component that'll actually handle these stats, like a stat manager component. And then we'll need to update the damage, and we'll need to update the actual ability itself, because when you when you use an ability, you want to use some sort of stat calculation. So, whether it be mana, energy, or in this case, because we're going to be doing it with data assets and things like that, we can have multiple stats affected. So if we have an ability that affects health and energy, we can have that easily by a list. So let's get to work on the component, and then we'll update the damage to use these new stats. Now onto the component. I created an interface for the stat user, which is going to go on something that uses the stats. So I created the stat user. So for example, our character, if any of our blocks want to have health or anything like that, we'd add this to it. Because basically the stat user is the thing it allows us to basically point to this component. And the reason I'm doing it this way as well is because you can have stats on a player, and you can have stats on a player's state. Having stats on a player, when you, let's say, die and respawn, you can have the stats will reset because you're technically going to destroy the player and then reinitialize the player. So if you have your stats on your player, you'll reset all your stats. If you decide to go with the player state, where you add the stat user and then the components on the player state, you can take this stat user, go to the player state, and then go to the component. So this will give us a little flexibility in how we want to use that. And that also allows us to use it on actual actors itself, because actors don't have player states. So if you wanted to put it on the player state, you can do it that way. If you wanted to do it on a regular actor, you can do it this way. So this gives us a way, when we do our damage, we can just say, is the stat user? If it's a stat user, pass through the stats. So the stat user has and it has a do stat modification. So the stat modification is going to take in our estat enumerator plus the float values that we want to make. So as you would expect, the input is called stat modifications, because this is the stat we want to modify, and then this is the amount we want to modify by. So that's for the stat user. Then we have a stat manager, and the stat manager basically has the same thing here. stat modifications with this, and it has update stats. Now the update stats, so this first interface, the stat user will point to the component, and then it will pass that data to the component through the interface. So that's how this is going to work. That's the general gist of it. Now, for the stats, there was a small update to the object here, which is no surprise because the object that I created, the stats object, is it's just a starter object. So obviously we'll need to start building out functionality as we go along, but I added a update current value. And so this will take in the amount, and then it'll return the current, the new value, the modified value. So this update current value is exactly what you think it would be. It's over here, update current value, right here. And so this takes the current value, adds the amount, clamps it between the max value. I did set a max value maximum here of 100 so far. Obviously, we can change that upon initialization, but for now, for testing purposes, I'm going to leave it at 100. And so this just sets, and then it just returns that value. So that would be in the stat type class here. Now, over in the component, what we want to do for when we replicate it, we want to take that interface call, update stats, and we're going to take the stat modification and we're going to pass it to a server call here, right? Server, run on reliable, run on server reliable. And we're going to loop through each of those keys, find it in the stats map that we added to this component. We added to this component. We'll find it in that stats map. If it's in that stats map and it's in the stat modifications, I don't know why I did this. It's just, I don't know, maybe it looks just nicer. But either way, if it's in the stats table here and it's in the stat modifications that you're sending it in, then do that update current value on this stat object. Now, of course, this map might look a little weird because the key is the eStat and the value is actually the interface for the stat type. So that's how we're going to modify the current value, right? And now off the completed, what we want to do is we want to multicast that stat update. And so what we're doing here is that the current value that we have, right, is server side. However, the client needs to know about the stats, right? Because you don't want the stats to be out of sync. So off that stat, you would then run a multicast here, multicast reliable, and just do a set. And that is basic gist of how, that's like your most basic how networking works. You send it to a server call, the server does a validation, does an update, and then just simply multicasts out that update. In which case, the update here is just a set. Okay, let's modify the damage to apply some of these stats, and we'll also probably need to at least initialize it with some basic stats when we begin play. So let's do that. So the first step we're going to do for modifying the damage, we're going to go back into the damage properties data here, where we had the base damage here, right? We had like the base damage. Now we're going to replace that with a map of an eStat and a float, which is going to be the stat and then the modification amount. Obviously, so this stat, it's called stat modification. So this is going to basically just easily plug right into our component when we need to make the modifications. So we'll change up the data asset, and then we need to go and change up when we apply the damage. Next. Now, after saving that modification and reloading, just so that the data asset updates here, we now have the ability to add a stat modification. We're going to modify health, and we're going to modify health by, I guess, by 10 in this instance. So for this damage type, physical, I guess, for the example here, we've got the root data, the damage, and we have the hit amounts, the cooldown, and now we have the stat modifications, and we can modify stats. We can obviously add energy here, so if we want to modify multiple stats here, we can simply do that. So now we can add like damage fire, and we can modify health. We can add maybe like a frost attack that modifies the energy and the health, and maybe like a lightning attack that only does energy. So this will allow us to modify these various stats when we deal damage. So let's go update the damage ability now to to make use of that, because now it's broken here, but we have the stat modifications. So we have the hit actor, we have the stat modifications, we have the interface. So let's just do it. Quick note here too about the data asset. Since this is going to be, since we saw when we update it, we do an addition. So when we want to modify health now, this is actually going to be negative. So if we want to modify health by healing, let's say, instead of damage, instead of physical here, we want to heal. We can say damage heal, and then we can fill out all this stuff with positive 10, for example. And maybe it'll hit twice or something. So just a little quick note there that this is actually going to be negative, because that is the amount that we're modifying the health by, which is negative 10 in this case, because it's damage and not a heal. If it was a heal, we'd go positive. That's it. Now over in the apply ability damage, right? So in our base ability damage here, now we have the damage properties data, right, as before. But instead of passing that into a damage node instead of passing just like a single value, we can now take those stat modifications that we added to this properties data, and off that false, instead of dealing the damage, I'm going to do a sequence here. So basically the first pin here, it's going to go take that hit actor that we saved before, because this is the one that we were actually dealing damage to. We're going to say, is it a stat user? Does it have the stat user interface? If it does, which means the object on the other side is valid. If it's valid, we'll do the stat modifications passing in that stat modifications here. And if it's not valid, we'll just destroy the damage actor, because if it's not a valid stat user, then it doesn't care about damage, and so it'll just destroy it. We can probably do a little bit of additional logic here, but that's fine for now. And then, of course, off the second sequence pin, update that hit counter. And now the reason I did it this way in the sequence is because you would have to put these nodes off both of these. You'd have to point both of these into this if you wanted to, because you'd have to go off of is and is not. So instead, I just did a sequence. That's it. So now let's do the stat user part. So we're going to add the stat user here interface to our other character. Well, we're going to add it to our own character, but it's going to be, there's two characters in the world. And so let's do that. I'll add a print statement to this, and then we should be able to see the stat modifications. Well, we'll need to set up some default values. So I'll have to add an initialize. That shouldn't be too bad. Now over in our character, we'll add the stat manager component. We can add this to any actor, because that's what it is. It's an actor component. On the initialize here, we set up the stat manager component. We set a variable for it. In the class settings, we added the stat user interface. Now we have do stat modifications down here. And so when we implement this now, when we do the stat modifications, we can send this to a server call, and then send it to the, well, actually, we're already doing a server call. So off of this, we just grab our stat manager component. And here's where we could point this instead. When we do the stat modification, we could point this to the player state, but in this case, we don't need to. So we can just do an update stats. Now, of course, I think in the sake of completion, we should probably make this a server call for now. So let's do that, but this is going to be the basic update here. Now over in the stat manager component, I added a new function to this called Initialize Stat, and the stat database. So this has the primary data asset stat type here, set as the default, because this contains all of our class, or the classes that we need. So in our Initialize Stat here, we'll make a server call. We'll go to the stat database. We'll find that stat type from the enumerator. We'll just check to see if it exists. If it does, we'll grab the class. We'll do a construct object, which will construct this object. We'll pass it as the interface, and then we'll set the key, and then we'll do the multicast of the stat update, because this stats, remember, will need to broadcast the update. Whenever we change these stats, we'll need to multicast this update. So yeah, let's move on to the next thing. We'll need to do a little bit more here. We'll make this a server call. We'll add, or I might make it a server call. We'll see how it works out, but that should be it. We'll just have to add the initialize to the character, add an initialize stats for this stat component, and then let's go and test it out. I just want to make a quick note too. While you're debugging interfaces, if you see that your as here, when you do your hit actor and you add a breakpoint and you see that this is coming back as unknown, just double check to make sure that you have your as set up here for self. Because if this is not connected, like this will come back as null. And you'll be like, why is this going not valid? Well, maybe you forgot to set up self. Just a quick note. So over in the character, right, now we're going to initialize the stat of health in our stat manager component. So our initialize, we'll just initialize it to whatever ID we passed it in. We have a database now added, right? We've got the database added here. So it can query the database, grab the stat, construct the object, and then add it to the map. Then multicast the status update for this variable. That's how this, so we're reusing that. That's perfect. I did add an initialize here. So this initialize for the stat type base will just take whatever the current value here is, and it'll just set it to the max value. So the value will be 100, max value will be 100. Simple as that. That's, of course, was added to the interface. So now on the player character, so now when we deal the damage, right, we do the stat modifications based on whatever value we get from the primary data asset. So in this case, I did update the damage here to be health minus 0.25 for 25 times over and every hit every 0.1 second, right? So every time it now deals damage, it'll do that stat modification, which will then be handled in this component through our character. It'll all be replicated, so we don't have to worry about it. Now, in action, we can see that if we go up to our player character, since it has the interface for the stat user and we're doing a stat modification based on the primary data asset, we can walk up and we can, if I can hit the projectile, you'll see that it'll decrease by 0.25 every 0.1 second for 25 times. And they ended up at like 93.75 or something like that, right? You can see that again. Now, if we wanted to change the damage, let's say, oh, that's really overpowered. Maybe we only want to make it 10 hits, but let's say, I don't know, maybe a 0.5, maybe half the time, let's say. So now we're modifying the health value by negative 0.25. And there you go. It went down to like 97 something. So there. And we're modifying health by that amount. Every hit, every damage on the projectile. So that's fantastic. Let's move on to like the energy system now. You know, for example, whenever we want to use a projectile, we might want to use some energy. So in order for our abilities to use, let's say, an energy system, over in the ability data, we're going to add the ability cost here, which will be our map here with our estat and floats. So, and this is going to be our ability cost. Now over in our action component, we will, on the begin play, we will actually save the stat user as the interface call here, the owner as the stat user, and as this action user. So we'll be able to check for validity for either one of these if we need to use stats. And so now off the activate, we're probably going to need to do a bit more logic here. For example, if the cost is 10, but you only have like 8 energy. And that's why I'm thinking we might need to add a Boolean off of this do stat modification, because basically if it goes below 0, we want to say that it couldn't do the stat modification, I guess. I don't know. We'll need some logic, though, for this cost to just double check that the stat that we're modifying is okay to modify, basically. And that should be it. Now we just add the energy cost to the data asset here. and then add the initialize for the energy. One quick restart later to get the data asset to update with the structure. We now have the ability cost here. I'm going to put in energy. This should suck the energy here from this, from that, and I believe if we hit play, there you go, 50, and then 0. And of course, we don't have any more logic, so it'll still say 0. But that's fine. That's all right with me. Because we can always add that logic for the stat cost later. That really shouldn't be that hard. We can make either another call for an interface method or function to return that Boolean, or we could just return a Boolean off of it for a little bit more versatility. But yeah, in the character though, in the character we initialize the stat. Where am I? Here I am. So we initialize the stat, right, as the energy. So that's how we did it. So now we can initialize a stat on our stat component of energy. We have health. We can now modify these through this component, which handles, or this is the action component, the stat manager component, which will handle all of our stat updates, and it'll be network replicated. I know this was a bit of a might have been a bit of a long one, but I hope you found that helpful, and I hope it gives you a good idea of what you should do, or maybe if you get any other ideas, or maybe modifications or updates to how the system could work, um, or maybe you're just having problems with maybe figuring out a simple stat system. Well, here it is. Here's a simple stat system. Anyways, guys, have a good one, and I will see you in the next one.